Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk.
Jack, thank you so much for joining us on the Prospect podcast today. First of all, for the benefit of our listeners, take us through the basics. What is temporary accommodation? Who lives in it? What's it like to live in it? What is this thing that you've investigated for us?
So temporary accommodation means lots of different things. It's really quite difficult to determine what exactly it is in every case, but it's on a broad spectrum from people living in hotels because they might have been renting in the private sector, for example, and they might have been kicked out by their landlord. They might just need a one night or a week stay in a hotel while they find somewhere else, to all the way at the other end of the spectrum, where you might have presented homelessness to your council and you might say, I need some help. Can you help me with accommodation? They might place you might be a London local authority, for example. They might place you in Durham or Manchester or Telford, and you could be there hundreds of miles away from your support network in a place that you don't know, with young children, for example. There are lots of those cases that have schools in London, but they're much further, and you could be living there for quite a while, and that totally disrupts your entire life.
So this is something that, like, my local authority, if I was facing homelessness, would be obliged to find me somewhere to live until I can kind of find something more permanent. Is that how it works?
Yeah, that's correct. Local authorities are obliged; they're legally obliged to find you somewhere or to help find you somewhere. But where exactly and the quality of the accommodation, those are the kind of real crunch points. And so what we see is people are in increasingly very poor forms of accommodation, very unregulated, and for extraordinarily long periods of time.
And this could be anyone, right? It's not necessarily an asylum seeker, for example, or it could be anybody who's basically facing any family facing homelessness, or person living on their own facing homelessness, right?
Yeah, correct. There's two dimensions to this kind of challenge. On the one hand, we spoke to people as part of this investigation that were working full time, that had been working all of their lives, that had kind of quite successful careers in some cases. I spoke to one gentleman whose daughter was on a university program at MIT or some highly ranked university in the US, for example. But at the same time, he was here working but homeless. And then there are other households that are really struggling. They might be in receipt of benefits, for example. They might be victims of domestic abuse. Might be a mother and her children or a child, and 38% of people in temporary accommodation are classed as vulnerable by the government. So on the one hand, high disproportionate number of vulnerable people, and on the other hand, people that you would walk past and kind of, you'll know them as friends, they've got jobs and so on, but they might be homeless.
Jack, and in the piece, you say that there are more than 100,000 households in temporary accommodation at the moment, and that this has gotten worse in recent years, right? It's increasing.
Yes. So there are about 150,000 households in temporary accommodation. That kind of obscures the number because some of them are families with children. There might be 4 or 5 people in that family. Others are single households. And that's been getting worse for about the last 15 years.
This story of temporary accommodation is also kind of a story about councils across Britain. Can you tell us a bit about why temporary accommodation has become such a problem right now and how it fits into that broader story that we've talked about before, on this podcast and in Prospect more widely, about the challenges facing councils?
Yeah, so it's within the context of the housing crisis in the first instance. We aren't building at the scale that we need to build, which means that councils increasingly have fewer options available to them when they're placing people in temporary accommodation, for example. Another example might be that the money that local authorities receive in order to place people in temporary accommodation has not risen for 13 years. So as private rents have gone up and hotel costs have gone up and so on, local authorities are less able to place people in, for example, relatively secure private rented accommodation, and are instead forced to kind of choose whether or not they eat into their own budgets. And some of them, or most of them, have done that to some degree, but they can only tolerate a certain amount of that, or whether they find cheaper forms of accommodation, which are inevitably.
Yeah, I mean, and just briefly give us a sense of what it's like within local councils at the moment. What kind of pressures are they under? What does it feel like to be making those decisions?
Yeah, so I mean, they are under extraordinary kind of financial pressure, and that drives a lot of the decision making. So you will have, members of staff, officers in councils that are trying to work out where they allocate people and so on, doing their daily jobs. And then at the top of the kind of food chain in local authorities, you will have political leaders and leaders at an officer level saying, well, we need to cut budgets at the same time and so on. So there's a real kind of tension there. The other point I would say is the scale of the challenge now. It's almost become a kind of conveyor belt. We've lost a bit of the humanity from the process, and so people that are working in these sorts of roles in local authorities are kind of just trying to keep up with the demand and get people placed somewhere at the expense of whether or not it's suitable for them or whether or not it does long-term harm to them.
We'll come back to the issue of temporary accommodation in a minute, but I wanted to ask you first of all to just take us through. This is an FOI investigation, so it's based on freedom of information requests. Can you talk us through the process of that? How did you approach doing this reporting?
Yeah, so one of my concerns about temporary accommodation is how much we know. And the government collects quite a lot of information on temporary accommodation and homelessness, but there are some areas where we don't know very much. And it's the areas that we focus on in the investigation. It's how far we're sending people. And in some cases, we're sending them hundreds of miles away from London to the top of the country. And it's how long we're sending them for. And there's some other dimensions to those questions. Some academics would call it kind of social cleansing. That's not a language that I'd use, but you tend to see people get shifted from more affluent areas to more disadvantaged areas. So I was in particular interested in filling those evidence gaps effectively, trying to tell us something that we don't already know about the challenge of temporary accommodation. There are 317 local authorities in England, but that temporary accommodation is most acute in London first and foremost, followed by Manchester and Birmingham. And then outside of that, a kind of range of places, some of which are cities, but some of which are kind of in the home counties and on the outskirts of London, that because they're relatively cheap, people end up getting put there. So, places like Canvey Island or Clacton or Thurrock in Essex are kind of prime examples where people end up getting placed. So I've tended to focus my freedom of information requests on those sorts of authorities. We do know from the government data where the local authorities are that are most acute, that are engaging in placements, for example. So that gives us a good kind of telltale sign of where we should focus our requests.
And you've been sending these FOIs to councils, right? You haven't just been kind of sending freedom of information requests to Whitehall, to the Department for Housing and local communities and local government. You've been sending it to councils where there's a lot of temporary accommodation cases, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Because there's no central repository of that information, it's just a kind of arduous process of speaking to every single authority that you can and getting as much as you can from them. Councils are, by virtue of the financial challenges that they're facing, councils are not very good now at responding to FOI requests. So, in theory, it's nice to ask a local authority and get a response. In reality, it's you're negotiating, or it's like kind of ping pong in the parliamentary sense. I'm firing questions at them, they're finding ways through legislation to avoid answering them, and I'm reframing the questions. So there's a bit of kind of performance there. The other point I would make is people assume that you can just fire freedom of information requests off to councils, and you'll kind of get the answer, but it requires quite a lot of interpretation, because you always get kind of partial answers, or you'll realize that they don't collect data in that sort of way that you expected, so they will provide you a different response that other local authorities might require. So it's a little bit of a minefield in that sense as well.
One of the really fascinating points that you mentioned there, and I think that really comes out in the piece that you wrote for Prospect, is about this kind of movement of people in temporary accommodation from one local authority to another, and kind of the back and forth between local authorities, really. Can you maybe explain for listeners, a bit more about where you saw people going and how that kind of balanced out? So which councils are sending people where, and who are they housing?
So there's a real ripple effect to this process. So, the most affluent boroughs in the centre of London are largely placing people in their neighbouring boroughs, in kind of more disadvantaged outer London boroughs. Those disadvantaged outer London boroughs are placing people in cheaper areas, like the outskirts of Essex, as I'd mentioned earlier. And in other cases, there are some quite kind of famous instances in Durham, in Bradford, for example, where those leaders have kind of said, hold on, London as a whole, will you just stop placing people in my patch, because you're not telling me, which they're legally required to do, but local authorities don't always do that, which means that I'm not able to offer them services or support them or get their kids into our schools. Not only that, it's a cost shunting process. That local authority, by placing someone elsewhere, is essentially kind of then not covering the cost of all of the services that those people need. But you do tend to see, and something that I'd need to investigate further, you do tend to see the same places crop up in terms of where people place them. This is by design, and there are different reasons for that. One of them might be a kind of cost benefit analysis that is cheaper in some places than others. I spoke to one member of Parliament yesterday who said, well, actually, it's all about the third party providers, and they're kind of predatory, and they'll go to the sorts of places where there is, not particularly high demand and quite cheap. And then they'll go back to London and say, hey, we've sourced all of this accommodation, and they'll be the middle person. They'll take a slice off the top. But what you do see is, more disadvantaged areas tend to get families placed in them who, as I mentioned earlier, are vulnerable themselves and have high needs.
There was an astonishing statistic in your piece that something like in the borough of Haringey in London,
Yes, correct.
it was something like almost exactly the same number had gone out as had come in, and 15 different authorities had sent all those people to stay in Haringey, like 260 something on either side,
correct.
right?
Yeah, so Haringey sent out 260 people outside of its borough boundaries over a 3-month period. But at the same time, it received 232 households from 15 local authorities. There were 4 or 5 London authorities that didn't respond to that. So, there is a totally plausible scenario where actually it received more people than it sent out. It's this. I think that's probably the most tangible example of the incoherence of the system, which has kind of horrible human impacts. And there was an organisation called Capital Letters, which was set up to kind of begin to tackle this issue, right? If we just had better coordination, then maybe we wouldn't be all sending them in each other's boroughs paying more, and instead, the local authorities that put them in Haringey could not put them there, and then Haringey could place their own residents in those accommodations. But that conversation hasn't really happened. Ironically, Capital Letters, this institution that was set up, was free for council members. And not too long ago, it said, well, we need a membership fee now. We expect 50 grand a year from you, which is a reasonably small figure in the context that, on average, London authorities have about a £200 million budget. And half of those London authorities left temporarily because they didn't want to pay the fee. I think in the end, Capital Letters said, okay, we'll defer the membership fee for a year, and they all rejoined. But, ironically, this is a kind of massive scale challenge, and the institutions that exist to support fix the challenge, this kind of, this small voluntary institution that doesn't charge its members is just totally unequipped to actually deal with that.
One of the other really astonishing themes in your piece, or stories in your piece, was the lack of coordination between different councils on prices, basically, of accommodation they use, because a lot of them are going to hotel chains like Travelodge, Premier Inn, are some that you mentioned in the piece. You got responses from them on this issue as well. And one council leader told you that he's tried to get, I think it was Greenwich Council, he's tried to get kind of hotel companies together to negotiate prices to maybe provide services to people staying in the hotels, and then actually it's really difficult. There's sort of, at the moment, kind of various councils in England are all sort of like booking these hotel rooms last minute without getting special prices or negotiating it or anything, right? It's just kind of a very unplanned system.
Yeah. So the nature of the challenge means that there's always going to be some messiness, right? A family might turn up at the council's door at 5 o'clock on a Friday because their landlord's turfed them out. And so there's always going to be some degree of needing to rely on short-term measures. But as you say, it's kind of exactly that. You've got local authority. I'm quite critical, I think, in the piece of quite a number of local authorities, but there are some that are trying to address those challenges, and I think Greenwich is a good example of that. But it's butting up against a kind of national housing crisis, international hoteliers that are kind of profiting from it. And I should be clear, there are lots of other local authorities locally, just lots of other hotels locally, single chain hotels that are doing pretty well out of this and, have no interest in it being fixed. And then you've got the government, which we haven't mentioned as much, and specifically the Home Office and how it deals with asylum processes. And what it does is it basically gazumps all of those local authorities first. So it gazumps them, it pays the most, and then
to get to house asylum seekers.
Once those asylum seekers receive their settled status, they are then, by a kind of what's the best way of describing this? Pot luck or bad luck if you're a local authority. They are then that local authority's responsibility. So ironically, those local authorities have an incentive to kind of be reticent to support asylum seekers as well, because the cost then passes from the Home Office to them. But
how much are local authorities spending on these hotels?
Yeah, so on hotels, local authorities spent about 390 million last financial year. About 50% of that comes from London authorities. And unfortunately, the government, for reasons that I don't quite understand, unpublishes its data after 3 years on temporary accommodation. So we can only look back to 3 years. What we do see, though, is that from the previous year and the year before that, it's rising significantly. And hotels, of course, is just a part of the broader temporary accommodation challenge, which now costs more than £1 billion.
One of the other things that comes out in the piece, so we've talked about some statistics, some figures, and for lots of people, the idea of local government is quite distant and quite hard to connect to. But in the piece, you do talk a little bit about what it's actually like for people to live in temporary accommodation as well. I mean, what do you think from your research our listeners won't know about what it's like to live in temporary accommodation?
So I suppose council-owned temporary accommodation is interesting because it's easy to understand that a council might put you in, a private rented house which might be next door to you. Some councils, though, do that and also have their own temporary accommodation sites. And these are usually, they don't feel like homes. I was going to say office blocks, but that's not quite how they feel. But, they're buildings that had a previous use which wasn't to house people in the most part. And then over time, they've been used for homes. And in the piece, some people described it to us as kind of, they'd use military language or NHS language where they'd talk about how sterile it was, or they'd call them barracks or wings. And actually, I spoke to council officers that use those terms as well. And that kind of seems to sum up pretty much what the accommodation's like. There's a kind of absence of hope in many cases. In some cases, it's actually outright dangerous, where families of fleeing domestic abuse are put in the same accommodation sites as, for example, people that have just left prison and present themselves as homeless. So there are some really bad policy decisions that some councils are making, but generally it's not a place that you would want to live because of the additional needs that some people have that are homeless. You end up kind of putting together, young families with men with pretty unsavory histories and so on. So it's not somewhere that you want people to stay in the long term, but there isn't really anywhere else to place them.
You also write in the piece that people are kind of, their stuff is in storage, the really practical stuff. They can't have their pets maybe in the hotel or the council owned accommodation. And it's really disruptive for kids, but they might be kind of housed, hours away from their school. So it's a kind of if you're placed in accommodation that isn't disruptive, it's incredibly lucky because most of it is.
I think it's one of the difficulties is just the real psychological challenge of being homeless in your kind of daily life. As you mentioned, you might not have cooking facilities. You might have stuff in storage, but you might have to pay your local authority to put them in storage. And that storage might be quite far and you might not be able to access your own belongings whenever you like. We spoke to kind of individuals that said, we've got kids, particularly young kids, when they're sick or, let's be honest, when you need to be on the toilet because you've got a bad tummy, you're sharing a toilet with 10 people and you've got people outside of that door saying, knocking on it, saying, I need to come in, and your poor child's in there ill. It really kind of, it's really denigrating, I think, for some people. And so what you actually find is, in some of those temporary accommodation sites where they have kitchens, communal kitchens, no one uses them because it kind of works for no one. No one feels comfortable using them. They don't feel like their food is safe. They haven't really got a safe space to store their medicines if they need to be in fridges. And so people end up kind of regressing into the very small rooms that they have where they might have a microwave perhaps, and they'll be there. Just one point of hope that I'd like to inject was one of the people that we spoke to for the investigation. They had been in 3 hotels for just over a year, and this gentleman, his wife was quite ill. She had quite a lot of seizures in the hotels that she was living in, and his mother-in-law was also with them in another hotel room in the same hotel. And he said that he had a parrot that he kept in his room, which I find quite funny because you might expect a dog or a cat, and it was a parrot, and I assume parrots make an awful lot of noise, but it was this kind of gentleman's agreement where the hotel knew that he had the parrot, and he knew that the hotel had that the hotel knew, but neither of them just told the council, and so it was really a good example of like finding ways to make the best of the situation that you're in. And I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah. What were you most surprised about from them? I mean, you've looked at this, you've researched this topic for a long time. What were you most surprised in the research you did for us?
Surprised. I'm always surprised about the kind of lack of political will, I think. So in the case of temporary accommodation, some of that accommodation is so poor just because the politicians have never actually bothered to visit them. It's almost a kind of, a systemic challenge. I feel like, you could present some of this work to the politicians at the authorities that they're in, and they would be shocked to learn that their authority does this. And so it always strikes me that some of the small asks that people in temporary accommodation would have, good Wi-Fi, bit of paint on the walls to give them a bit of mental stimulus, or a slightly better green space, or those sorts of easy and in some cases relatively cost-free or cheap solutions are never really taken up by that many local authorities. So this is just seen as an issue, quite frankly, through the lens of the cost to the local authority to lots of politicians, and not as a kind of well-being, social health crisis as well.
The UK has more people living in this kind of accommodation than any other nation I think in the OECD. So, I mean, why is that? Why is the problem worse in the UK than elsewhere? And are there any lessons from other countries for the UK about what could be done next to improve the situation you've described?
Yeah, so it's at the macro level, really. We don't build enough homes. Certainly, countries of a similar size like France build significantly more homes than we do. We have policies like right to buy, where social housing, that's primarily the housing that you would be putting some of these families and individuals in if you had it, is of course being sold off because people are purchasing it. The government's since brought out a consultation to look at changing or reforming some of that. So it's those kind of big factors that have meant we've just not had enough supply. At the same time, there's a much more preventative focus on supporting families before they get to crisis point has been lost as local authorities' budgets have been stripped back and they've just lost the capacity and the capability to do that. So, adequately investing in local authorities is another start as well, a good start as well.
One part of the story also of this scandal, this national scandal, is that homelessness rose really steeply under the Conservatives during the policy of austerity. It had almost rough sleeping had almost sort of been had almost gone under New Labour, right? And then the Tories kind of start cutting budgets and it goes up again. But also temporary accommodation, the rate of people being placed in it has also gone up, also went up in those 14 years since 2010. We now have a budget. We now had a budget a few weeks ago. What is Rachel Reeves? Has she kind of pledged anything that will help address this issue? What is Labour planning to do, or are they planning to do anything?
Yeah, so the budget announced 233 million on temporary accommodation, which is of course a welcome cash injection, but won't take us anywhere near the amount of money that would be needed to put into it.
That's money for councils to spend on it?
Yes, that's money for councils to spend on temporary accommodation. I think the Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who's kind of has overall responsibility for this, has also kind of said, we will look at how it's funded because at the moment, the kind of economics of homelessness just don't work out. Should it be funded in a different way? And so in particular, I think she's kind of talked more about the government funding temporary accommodation. There are models where, for example, you give councils a big cash injection, but they spend that on buying up new properties and then they use them for people that are in temporary accommodation. That will be a big capital injection in the short term, but in the long term, you'd be spending significantly less on temporary accommodation. So there are those sorts of options available. I suppose this is just the kind of rub of the challenge that I want to pose, which is all of those things are long-term solutions. And the issue is that we have over 150,000 households in temporary accommodation now. And so much of the focus has been on getting those people out of temporary accommodation or preventing people from being in temporary accommodation. Whereas I think that's extremely important and you need to do that. But at the same time, you also need to think, how can we improve the lives of the people which we realistically know are going to be in there for several years? And that I think is much cheaper, but is not a big kind of electoral grabbing priority.
We sort of haven't talked about this in detail, but one of the other absolutely shocking statistics or numbers in your piece was about kind of the length of time that some people have spent in accommodation. As you say, it's unavoidable. Some people are going to be in there, but I think there's at least one case, is this right, of somebody who's been in temporary accommodation for or in a hotel. I mean, yes. You explained, but for a very long time.
So, in Hackney, someone had been in a hotel for 2,929 days, and going back to the kind of methodological challenges with freedom of information requests, because it was 2,929, I assumed it was maybe a mistake. So I went back and said, hang on, can you clarify this? And they said, yeah, we've had a single person household in that case, so it wasn't a family, single person household in a hotel for that long. And they kind of said, the officer said in their response, it quote wasn't ideal. But that that individual was by far not the only person that's been in temporary accommodation for extremely long amount of time. We also sketch out, I think, Barnet and maybe Kensington and Chelsea, where it was over 5 years. More generally, outside of hotels, people have been in temporary accommodation for even longer. So some previous work that I've done found that some people had been in temporary accommodation for over 2 decades, which is just absolutely extortionate. And so it does seem to be getting longer. And then the final point I'll make is there isn't much kind of legislation or regulation governing this. And I think quite rightly, really, because where there is, local authorities don't adhere to it, not because they don't want to, but because the housing crisis is so acute. So in hotels with children, the statutory limit is 6 weeks. But in reality, because there aren't many places to place people, that's increased by 600%. The number of children that have been in hotels for longer than the statutory 6-week period has increased by more than 600% over the last 3 years. And so there's this kind of risk that we say, oh, well, let's just place a legal limit on the amount of time people can stay there. But then you don't do anything beyond that to actually prevent them staying there for that long. But we are absolutely going to see people stay in temporary accommodation for longer.
Has anyone been, so you said before that you made this point about, there's the housing crisis and the supply and like over time bringing homelessness down so people don't end up in temporary accommodation. But you said, that in the meantime, you've got all these people living in this incredibly disruptive way. And there are things you can do to at least make their lives a bit nicer. You talked to some people in the piece who are some charities or the head of the council leader at Greenwich who are trying to do things. Are there any like MPs? Is anybody kind of pushing to do that, to do what you suggested, to do these kind of more short-term things so people can just have a better standard of living in the meantime?
Yeah, I mean, there have been advocates in Parliament to address temporary accommodation in general, and kind of, Karen Buck, who was a Member of Parliament for Westminster and the Cities of London until recently, was one of those. Siobhan McDonough, who's also an MP in Mitcham and Morden, maybe, is another example of that. You tend to, I suspect, see the advocates around London because that's where it's most acute. But I don't think there is much focus of eking out that kind of space to think about short-term solutions, because the horizon has been on, building the social homes that we need. There are kind of specific focuses. So going back to the point I made about psychological insecurity, people not knowing when they might move and so on, there has been kind of focus through, for example, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for temporary accommodation on, how you might improve that system. The reality is almost like that story a couple of weeks ago where I think Northern Rail said they still use fax machines. When I asked as part of this investigation, what's your process for notifying places? You expect it to kind of, be properly recorded and so on. And what we found out was that, some local authorities were sending letters, which feels quite archaic to send a letter to another local authority. Others were sending emails, but they were saying, well, sorry, we don't actually know. We can't retrieve any of that because our staff have since left. So we think we've notified people, and they would also be quite clever with the language, local authorities. I would say, how many have you notified, or, when
you're saying notified, you mean of the people that you've sent to they've sent to another local authority for temporary accommodation.
Correct.
Yeah.
And they would kind of, they would say that it's a legal duty without actually saying that they had complied with it. So it was kind of quite clear that, that sort of process could definitely be improved. And I think MPs have paid quite a lot of attention to that because of the sense of insecurity that it creates about people not really knowing where they're going and when they might have to move.
Well, Jack, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for the amazing investigation that you did. You can read it in the last issue of Prospect magazine or on our website.